You know, back when there were Christian bookstores, they used to have those coffee mugs right up front, kind of like this one, but the difference is it would have one of our favorite verses right there. I still remember one of my favorite coffee mug verses forever was Jeremiah 29:11. And if you read it, I'm sure you're going to recognize it. Here it is. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. I mean, if there's ever a coffee mug verse, this is it. But the funny thing about coffee mug verses is often we rob them of the context that surrounds them. And I want to tell you that as we talk about hope, because Jeremiah 29:11 is all about hope, it unfortunately robs it of the context that I think gives it light, that gives it really strength in our life. You see, Jeremiah 29:11 was written right before one of the most tragic moments in all of the Hebrew people's history. Up until the Holocaust, this was seen as the worst moment of suffering, the most silent God had ever been, the most difficult thing that Israel had ever gone through. And that's the Babylonian exile. And let me just tell you a little bit about this, because this really is a heartbreaking kind of a approach to ruling. You see, the Babylonians were known for ruling through fear. They had a few different principles that would help them. And I don't want to get into the bloody or the horrible, but I do want to tell you this, that when they came in, the stories that they had, the way they conquered made things like the fiery furnace look like a child's story. The way they left cities desolate was heartbreaking. But it gets even worse. You see, if you were a survivor, if you were conquered, they had three principles that would help them rule over you. The first one is that they would actually take you from your city, so in this case, Jerusalem, and they would pull everyone from Jerusalem and move them to a new part of the empire. So they were in an unfamiliar territory. And this is a big deal because I think right now, if we're looking at our world, if we're looking at 2020, we recognize that this is a very unfamiliar territory for not just the church, but for us as families, as individuals. But it gets worse from there. You see, the second principle they had wasn't just to make your terrain unfamiliar. It was to isolate you from your family itself. So what they did, this is heartbreaking, is they would pull families apart. They would put siblings in different families with different parents. They would take husbands and pull them from their wives and their kids and marry them to women they didn't know and put them with children they didn't know. They would take wives and pull them from their husbands and marry them to men they didn't know and give them children they didn't know. And so when they did this, their hope was to isolate you. It wasn't just that you were in unfamiliar territory. It was that you had no community. The people that you were with weren't Jewish. They weren't Israeli. They weren't people that you were familiar with. They weren't a tribe you knew. They often spoke different languages. And so you were in unfamiliar territory, isolated and alone from everyone you knew you could find comfort with. And then the laws, the way they actually ruled, like I said, was something that made the fiery furnace look like child's literature, meant that they ruled through a third principle, fear. The weight of disobedience, the weight of this was so incredible that they literally had laws set in place, not just to dissuade you, but to dissuade the very thought of committing a crime. So you're in unfamiliar territory, living isolated from anyone you know or care about, and fearful of everything you do. And this was your day to day. I think, again, this may sound familiar for some of us in 2020, but this raises a question. You see, something incredible happens here is we have to remember Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. That was written right before the Babylonian exile. In fact, I wouldn't say this. It's not just written before the Babylonian exile. I will tell you that it was written for the Babylonian exile. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to point out that two of the books that come out of this exile, this time of suffering, this time of depression, this time of hardship, are the book of Daniel and the book of Esther. And while there are other books written during this time, no other book in the Bible is as clearly about the conversion of another nation as these two books. Not even the book of Jonah is actually about the conversion of Nineveh. It's about the difficulty the Israelites had accepting the idea that God could spare and save another nation. But here in Esther, you see not only Esther save her people, but Esther begin to set forth a path that would change the entire kingdom of Babylon. Not only in Daniel do you see God spare Daniel, but you see him begin to interact with Nebuchadnezzar, interact with Babylon in a way that would change Babylon. And so there are 2 points I want to leave you with. The first one is this, that if you are in a moment right now of isolation, of terror, if you're in a moment of unfamiliarity, if you're in a moment of suffering, Jeremiah 29:11 is for you. It's for you, and the idea here is that you can share Christ through your suffering and in your suffering in ways that you could never have impacted the world around you, those you love or care about, without that suffering. But the second thing I want to hit home with you guys today is this. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. This is not a verse dedicated to riches on earth or giving you a new car or a 6-figure job. This is a verse specifically pointed at your hardships and at your suffering. So if you're going through a tough time right now, this is the message God has for you. As you go throughout your lesson this week, as you guys talk in group, I want you to dig deep into this idea. What does it really mean that God's plans for you, that hope, not to harm you, but to give you life, this? What does it mean that this is built for times of suffering, that this is a promise for times of difficulty? Hope you guys enjoy a good conversation tonight, and we'll look for you next week. God bless.